Imagine you are 17 years old. It is 1682. You are in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, now finally complete, the cold stone palace transformed into something magnificent and suffocating. Your name is Henriette. Your mother prepared you for this morning by dressing you in silk so expensive it cost more than most families earn in a lifetime. She did not explain why. She simply tightened the laces until you couldn't breathe properly, and whispering whispered, "Don't cry. Never cry." You hear them before you understand. Footsteps. A voice that belongs to the man who owns everything. The man who owns you now. The king. Louis. He is 30 years old, and he has decided you will join his household. Not as a servant, not as a lady-in-waiting, as something else. Something without a name that polite society will never speak aloud. In a few moments, you will understand why your mother wept after she fixed your hair. In a few moments, you will realize that the life you had before, limited as it was, constrained as it was, is already gone. And there is no escape from a king. There is only the slow, deliberate breaking of everything you thought you were. This is not a story crafted for drama. What happened behind the doors of Versailles, in the chambers of the Louvre, in the private apartments of French kings, is documented. Not openly, not proudly, but documented nonetheless. In letters hidden for centuries. In the memoirs of ladies-in-waiting who dared to write what they saw. In the confessions of priests who heard what these women could tell no one else. In the medical records of physicians who treated the psychological and physical consequences. What makes this history particularly devastating is how methodical it was. This was not chaos. This was a system. A carefully constructed architecture of power designed to ensure that certain women, born into nobility, trapped by circumstance, or brought into the palace by promise, would have no agency, no protection, and no way to refuse a king. The historians who documented this era often glossed over these details with euphemisms. They called it royal privilege. They called it the customs of the court. They called it the nature of power. What they were really describing was systematic control over women's bodies, minds, and futures, enforced by the very institution that claimed to represent civilization and divine order. To understand what happened to women in the French court, you must first understand the man who perfected the system. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the absolute monarch, the king who believed himself to be the very incarnation of France itself. He did not merely rule France, he was France. And France, he had decided, belonged entirely to him. Before Louis, French kings had held power. But something changed in 1654 when the young Louis nearly died from a fever. When he recovered, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of authority. He had been given a second chance. The universe, he believed, had shown him that he was meant for something transcendent. He returned to power not as a man, but as an instrument of divine will. And if he was divine, then anything he wanted was automatically righteous. The Palace of Versailles was not built as a residence. It was built as a machine designed to consolidate power, to create total dependency, and to eliminate any possibility of resistance. Every corridor was designed to be observed. Every room was positioned so that privacy became impossible. The king did not hide his movements, he performed them. And everyone, from the highest nobility to the lowest servant, was forced to watch and participate in the theater of absolute power. Women in this system occupied a particular position. They were essential to the court's function, yet utterly subordinate to its logic. A noblewoman could not refuse the king. Her family would be destroyed if she did. A woman from a lesser house could be brought to the palace with a single command. her parents had no authority to protect her. Even wives and daughters of powerful men found themselves vulnerable, because the king's desire overrode every other claim on a woman's body and loyalty. The justification was simple. The king had the right to anything he wanted. His desires were not separate from the laws of the realm. His desires were the law. And any woman he chose to summon was obligated by duty, by law, by the very structure of French society, to submit without question. Refusal meant treason. It meant her family's ruin. It meant exile. It meant, in some cases, disappearance. Let us speak about what daily life actually meant for the women caught in this system. Take Françoise Athénise de Rochechouart, born into nobility but without the wealth to secure her own future. When she was brought into the king's circle, she was presented with an extraordinary opportunity, or so she was told. She could become a lady-in-waiting to the queen. She could live in the most magnificent palace in Europe. She could gain influence and security. What she actually gained was a cage made of gilt and silk. The king's attention fell upon her immediately. She was beautiful, intelligent, and, crucially, vulnerable. She had younger siblings whose futures depended on her securing a good marriage. She had a family that could be elevated or destroyed, depending on her ability to please the monarch. The king understood this about her. He used it. The emotional architecture was precise. Kindness followed by indifference, gifts followed by humiliation. A moment of genuine intimacy followed by being ignored in a crowded room while other women were chosen instead. The whiplash was intentional. It created a state of constant anxiety. Françoise found herself competing with other women for the king's attention, not because she wanted to, but because his favor had become the only thing that made her valuable. Her status, her security, her family's future, all of it hung on his mood on any given day. She was not alone in this experience. The king's mistress was not a position of power. It was a position of extreme precarity. Louise de la Vallière had preceded Françoise. Louise had borne the king 2 children. Louise had been adored, publicly displayed, elevated to a position where she seemed to have influence. Then the king's attention shifted. Louise was cast aside while still expected to remain at court, watching her replacement, seeing her children minimized, existing in a state of public humiliation that she could not escape. The psychological toll was immense. These women were not ignorant of their situation. They understood, with perfect clarity, that their value was temporary, that they were disposable, that their entire existence had been reduced to a single man's whim. Some became hard, protective of themselves, refusing emotional connection. Some broke completely, spiraling into illness or madness. Some, like Louise, sought refuge in religion, the only institution that might offer them an escape from the palace's control. But there were also mothers. Women with children born from the king's demand, children who would never be legitimate, who would live in a strange liminal space, royal enough to be privileged, but not royal enough to inherit, not royal enough to be fully acknowledged. These mothers lived with the constant terror that their children could be taken from them. And indeed, the king's children were often raised away from their mothers, ensuring that even motherhood, the one potential source of power and meaning in their lives, was taken from them. The structure of the court ensured that solidarity among women was impossible. The king could not be refused, but he could be influenced. So women competed. They watched each other for weakness. They reported each other's indiscretions. The system turned them into accomplices in each other's degradation, which meant that even if they had wanted to resist, there was no one they could trust. Isolation was guaranteed. Understanding what happened to women in the French court requires understanding that the king's interest in them was not primarily sexual, though sex was certainly part of it. What truly interested the king was control. It was the power to remake a woman's entire identity according to his will. It was the ability to take someone with agency, autonomy, and a sense of self, and reduce her to a reflection of his desires. The court itself was the stage on which this performance took place. Every woman's appearance, every gesture, every word was scrutinized. The king had opinions about how women should dress. He dictated fashion, quite literally, so that a woman who wanted to remain in his favor had to wear what he deemed appropriate. He controlled her appearance so completely that she could not even look at herself without seeing his preferences reflected back at her. The rituals of the court reinforced this control at every moment. Women were expected to be present during the king's private toilette, his dressing. They watched him bathe, dress, perform his elaborate morning routine. The intimacy was degrading. These moments were supposed to feel special, an honor to witness the king's private rituals. In reality, they served to remind women that there was no boundary between the king's life and theirs. He could summon them to his chambers at any hour. He could demand their presence. They had no right to refuse, no excuse that would be accepted. When the king became involved with a woman, it was announced. The entire court knew. The queen knew. The woman's family knew. There was no discretion, no pretense of secrecy. The king wanted everyone to understand that he had claimed this woman, that she belonged to him. The public nature of it meant that she could not deny it, could not hide from it, could not even pretend that something else was happening. She was marked as his, and everyone treated her accordingly. For some women, this public claiming brought a kind of terrifying elevation. They were given apartments in the palace. They were given money and jewels. They were introduced to the most powerful people in Europe. For a woman from a modest background, it could feel like a dream, but dreams end. And the moment the king's attention shifted, everything was taken away with the same speed it had been given. Others experienced it purely as violation. A young woman from the provinces, brought to the court to serve the queen, suddenly found the king's attention upon her. She had not encouraged it. She had done nothing to invite it, but her wishes were irrelevant. The king had decided she was beautiful. The king had decided she would be his. And the machinery of the court immediately shifted to accommodate this decision. She was isolated, positioned, made available. Her family could not protect her. Her friends at court, if she had any, could not help her. She was entirely alone, facing a man whose power was absolute. There is a particular kind of psychological torment that comes from understanding with absolute certainty that you have no escape. It is the moment when a woman realizes that she is not here by accident, that she was chosen deliberately, that the king does not love her. He has simply decided to use her, and that this will continue in whatever form he desires for as long as he chooses. The letters that survive from this period reveal this moment of clarity in women's own words. Hidden, encrypted, passed between trusted friends, women wrote about the horror of realizing that they had been deceived, that the promises made to them by their families, by the king's courtiers, by anyone who had suggested they should be grateful for this opportunity, were lies designed to make them compliant. Madame de Maintenon, eventually the king's final and longest-lasting companion, left a record of her awakening to this reality. She had come to court as a widow with nothing. She was nearly destitute. The king's attention, when it came, seemed like salvation. It took her years to understand that she had traded one kind of imprisonment for another. Security came at the price of freedom. Comfort replaced dignity, and she could never leave. The king had made it clear that she was his until death. The women could not openly resist, but they found other ways. They became expert at reading the king's moods, at knowing what he wanted before he asked for it. at creating a kind of psychological armor that allowed them to survive without breaking entirely. They developed codes with other women, ways of communicating beneath the surface of court life. They stole moments of genuine connection with each other, knowing that this was the only real human interaction available to them. Some women found power in the only way available to them, by becoming indispensable to the king's psychological well-being. If they could make him dependent on their presence, their counsel, their emotional support, then they became harder to discard. Madame de Maintenon eventually achieved this. She became not just the king's lover, but his confessor, his advisor, his companion. She lived in gilded captivity, yes, but her cage had become slightly larger, and she had become slightly less removable. This was not victory. It was merely a different form of subjugation, wrapped in more comfortable surroundings. But it reveals something crucial about the psychology of absolute power. Even when women had no formal rights, no legal recourse, no institutional support, they still found ways to assert their humanity. They still found ways to resist being completely consumed by the system. What happened to these women after the king's interest ended? The historical record becomes remarkably quiet at exactly this point. There are no official accounts of women being discarded. There are no court records addressing what became of them. There is only silence. Some women were given pensions. They were removed from court and provided with enough money to live quietly in the countryside. This was considered merciful. They were expected to disappear, to speak to no one about what they had experienced, to live out their lives in grateful silence. The generous treatment they received came with an implicit understanding. Your silence is the price of your comfort. Others were married off hastily to men of lower status, their dowries inflated to compensate for their tainted reputations. Everyone at court knew what these marriages meant. The women knew. The men they were being married to knew. It was an open secret that they were being packed away because they had become inconvenient. Some women were broken by the experience and simply removed from public life entirely. They retired to convents, where they could live in a kind of quasi-religious safety, away from the demands and cruelties of the world. The church, in this case, offered genuine refuge, though it came at the cost of renouncing the world entirely. The most devastating part of this historical record is not what was done to these women, terrible as it was, but what happened afterward. The palace that had consumed them became a monument. Visitors came from across Europe to marvel at Versailles. They walked through the same corridors, stood in the same rooms, and never asked what happened to the women who had been broken there. History remembered the architecture. History remembered the king's brilliance, his power, his vision. History largely forgot the women. What the French court did was perfected by other monarchies across Europe. The system of using women's bodies as instruments of state power, of removing their agency while appearing to honor them, of breaking their psychological resistance while maintaining the appearance of civility. This became the model for absolutist courts everywhere. Women suffered similarly in Vienna, in Madrid, in St. Petersburg. The tactics were universal. Only the names changed. Here is what remains unresolved in history. We have memorialized the kings. We have made legends of their reigns. We have written thousands of pages analyzing their political achievements, their military campaigns, their contributions to art and architecture. The palaces stand as monuments to one man's brilliance. The paintings were preserved. The blueprints were archived. But the women who were broken within those walls, history moved past them as though they were furniture. But the women whose lives were consumed? Their stories are fragments, scattered letters, occasional memoirs that contradict each other, cryptic references in court documents, gossip recorded by other women, distorted through layers of retelling. We do not have their full account. We have only broken pieces. This matters because it shapes how we understand power. When we celebrate the Sun King, when we admire Versailles, when we speak of the absolutist monarchy as a remarkable achievement, we are, perhaps unconsciously, endorsing the system that made women's subjugation possible. We are saying that the architectural brilliance was worth the price of women's freedom. We are accepting the king's own narrative, that his desires mattered more than their humanity. The question that echoes from this history into our present is not whether such things happened in the past. They clearly did. The question is whether we have truly learned from it. Because the tools that made this system work are still present. The ability to isolate vulnerable people. The ability to make their survival dependent on submitting to someone else's will. The ability to convince them that their value is temporary and conditional. The ability to surround them with systems that reward their silence. The French kings are dead. Their palaces are museums. Their courts are historical curiosities. But the mechanisms that enabled their cruelty, the same methods that allowed them to control women through psychological manipulation, through making them compete against each other, through isolating them from support, through convincing them they had no alternative, these persist. They have simply evolved. They hide behind different language now. They call themselves different things. What Versailles taught us is that civilization is thinner than we want to believe. That beauty and cruelty can exist in the same moment. That power will always test the boundaries of what it can do to those beneath it. And that women, then as now, bear a particular burden in these systems. They are expected to be grateful for scraps of consideration while having everything essential taken from them. The women of the French court had no choice. They could not have resisted effectively. The system was designed to ensure their powerlessness. But we, reading their history now, do have a choice. We can continue to celebrate the monuments and forget the suffering. Or we can ask harder questions about what made these monuments possible. We can ask whose lives were consumed to build them. We can insist that history remember not just the kings, but the women. The silence that surrounds their suffering is not accidental. It is the final mechanism of control. It says, what happened to you does not matter enough to remember. It says, your pain was not important compared to the power you served. It says, be grateful you are not mentioned at all. That silence has lasted centuries. Perhaps it is finally time to break it.